The venerable firm Audio Research has recently undergone a big transition in ownership, in strategy, and in product offerings. We covered this extensively in a visit to their Minnesota headquarters in advance of the release of 6 new products this summer. Today, I'll be reviewing 2 of those products, the LS-3 preamp DAC and the S-100 solid-state power amp. We've covered the new D80 tube power amp, and we'll be covering the LS-2 tube preamp and the S-200 solid-state power amp soon. This review is part of our series looking for the best amplifiers and the best preamplifiers under $10,000. Since its early days, Audio Research has been a leader in tube amplification products, particularly preamplifiers and power amplifiers. Many of these, and there have been many over nearly 60 years, have become iconic products. These include the SP3 and SP10 preamps, and the D76 and Ref 600 power amps. Recently, Audio Research has released the outstanding 330M power amps, which we've reviewed at length. Bill Johnson, founder of Audio Research, was perhaps more responsible than any other designer for the revival of tube circuits in high-end audio. But he wasn't a tube zealot. Rather, he was an engineer, so he wanted to use the best devices for the purpose at hand, which meant that Audio Research has often offered some solid-state, i.e. transistor designs. Fast forward to 2025, and the most obvious drawback to tube designs is cost. It simply is the case that Class D transistor designs can be done at lower cost per watt than Class AB transistor designs, which in turn are less costly on average than Class A transistor designs or vacuum tube designs. A lot of this comes down to the complexity and capability of the power supplies involved and also relates to the heat dissipation and casework required by each design. Audio Research has a new strategy that involves bringing the brand to more consumers, which means designing products at lower price points. With this as a goal, Audio Research set out to build a line of solid-state amplifiers along with appropriate preamps. The amplifiers are designated S-100 and S-200, and they're 100 watt per channel and 200 watt per channel stereo designs in relatively compact casework, 19 inches wide, 6.75 inches high, and 17 inches deep. The new LS-2 tube preamp and LS-3 solid-state preamp are matching sizes. Today I'll be covering the S-100 solid-state amplifier and the LS-3 solid-state preamp. The S-100 is priced at $94.50 in US dollars. The LS-3 is priced at $74.50 US. I requested the LS-3 with the optional DAC card, which fits inside via a slot in the back. The DAC card is $1,000. A phono card can also be installed in its own slot, and it too is priced at $1,000, or you can order both the DAC card and the phono card for $1,500. The S-100 is a Class AB design. In our interviews, lead solid-state designer Mike Bettinger made it clear that the S-100 and LS-3 do not incorporate any breakthrough devices like black hole modulators or time redimensioning circuits. Instead, Audio Research is quite clear about using a design approach that involves 4 basic elements. Sub-circuit experience over many years that's led to employing approaches that tend to measure well and sound good. Extensive mathematical modeling of alternative topologies to find a set of likely best candidates. Careful parts selection, parts matching per unit, and parts layout based on experience. And finally, extensive listening to each prototype in the Audio Research listing rooms by Chief Sonic Evaluator Warren Gale, as well as the Chief Engineer of the product and an experienced listening panel. All right, let's talk about sound quality because that's really what we're here for. As you may know, we think there are limits to reasoning from features and circuits and materials to sound quality. Audio is just too complex for most of us to do that. So we listen, as always, using the absolute sound as our reference for identifying significant distortions or lack thereof. We have to have a reference to do this, so we use the most relevant one. I'll focus on the standout qualities of the products here, because if these aren't interesting, then you don't need to know about the rest of the story. I'll start with the S-100 amplifier. First, we'll talk about bass performance. Power amps often differ in bass performance. This is a tricky area because rooms have a big impact, so we want to carefully assess and describe what's going on. I found the S-100 to be among the best amps for bass performance that I've heard. The impressive thing is the quality of the bass, not the amount, although the bass levels are just about ideal in my calibrated listening room. But the quality of the bass is an impressive and believable combination of detail, texture, richness, and air. If you pull that sentence apart, you'll find aspects of bass performance that often don't go together except when you listen to real instruments. For example, good Class D amps often deliver very good detail but are lacking a bit or a lot of bass weight and texture. You'll also find Class A/B amps that have excellent bass power but aren't fully revealing of the details of acoustic instruments. The NAD C298 that I recently enjoyed does a nice job balancing detail and weight, but when you hear the S-100, you realize that these qualities can be even more like the absolute sound of string bass or kick drum. Stepping up to the MBL N51 integrated, which I think also does very well in this balancing act, also isn't quite on the level of the S-100, lacking a bit of detail and air that real instruments have as a signature. The Bryston 3B Cubed, another very good Class A/B amp in roughly this price range, is slightly soft in the bass when compared to the S-100 and to the absolute sound. The impressive thing is that the S-100 delivers more bass detail and yet has a sense of more bass impact. Amps that deliver impact with amplitude manipulation don't sound as musically right because they sacrifice detail. Now let's talk about mid-range fluidity. We want mid-range to seem neutral and balanced, but we don't want that to veer off course into cold or edgy or thin. The S-100 gets this right by offering good support in the lower mid-range while yielding excellent mid-range detail and openness. The S-100 sound has low compression and excellent openness without any sense of stridence. There is a sense of texture revealing the organic sound of mid-range instruments, which is sometimes smoothed over just a bit on competing amps. Again, the balance of these parameters, as in the bass, is marvelous and quite musically believable. I mentioned the Bryston 3B a minute ago, and it provides an interesting comparison. The S-100 sounds a bit more open and clearer, but I do think some listeners would prefer the very slight smoothing that the 3B provides. The S-100 is sonically calibrated, I think, to be the basis of a quite refined system. But if your speakers or your sources need some help, you may find that the S-100 doesn't ameliorate these issues. As we say, we're here to point out what equipment does. You have to know if those parameters are what you need. Now, next we should talk about treble smoothness. The S-100 makes a choice about treble presentation that will win some friends and not work ideally for others. Essentially, the treble is like the mid-range in that it's neutral and balanced but not harsh or strident. The thing is, some people want their amplifiers to act as treble tone controls, almost always looking for a downward tilt as frequency rises. The S-100 is not that amplifier. It's clean and smooth and transparent, but it won't create a treble tilt or sand the rough edges off aggressively voiced speakers or badly engineered recordings. There are, of course, other and perhaps better ways of generating this tilt, but some listeners are fixated on doing this with amplifiers. We should also mention power capability and dynamics. While nominally rated at 100 watts per channel into 8 ohms, the S-100 seems more powerful than that. It does have excellent dynamics, which helps. But I also got the feeling that it could deliver all of its full 200 watts into my 4-ohm Magico A5s in a 4,000 cubic foot room. Really what I'm stressing here is that the amp seems unstressed across many kinds of music, which may relate as much to the smoothness and fluidity described previously as to actual power output. But at reasonable listening levels, I would add that it isn't obvious that you would need more power than what the S-100 has with typical speakers. Of course, audio research does offer the related S-200 power amp if you really need more. If you get the idea that I was impressed with the S-100, you would be right. This is not an inexpensive amplifier, but it is the least expensive access point I've heard to nearly flawless high-end sound. I'll say more about this at the end. Now let's consider the obvious companion, the new LS-3 solid-state preamp. From a functional standpoint, the LS-3 works well, with one possible exception. First, if you only listen to streaming digital, and if you have a DAC with an excellent volume control, you may not need a preamp at all. There's a debate about whether DACs straight into amplifiers are an improvement or a step backwards sonically. This, in my experience, is a function of the design of different DACs. There are other reasons to want a preamp, of course. As a bit of review, a preamp is a simple sounding device which does three things. First, it allows easy switching between components. For example, you might have a turntable and a streamer DAC and a CD player. The preamp can choose which of these has its signals sent to the power amp. Second, the preamp can bring the signals from the different devices to the right level and impedance to get full power from the power amp. Especially important with turntables, but also signal quality with some DACs. And third, the preamp supplies a remote and a front panel analog volume control for easy adjustments and minimal damage to the signal. Assuming you need these features, you would want something like the LS-3 as a front end for a power amp like the S-100. All right, let's talk about neutrality. I thought the LS-3 was impressively neutral. The lower to upper frequency balance is exemplary, and the dynamics are very good. As with the S-100, the LS-3 isn't a sort of tone control, so it won't be everyone's cup of tea. Compared with preamps at 2x or 5x the price, the LS-3 has a minor layer of gauze that lets you know it's in the circuit in between whatever your source is and your power amp. But on an album-to-album basis, it's really hardly noticeable, and the neutrality of the sound is ideal. It's your call whether the price premium needed to address this small deviation from the absolute sound is worth it. Then let's talk about the DAC card. For the money, the LS-3 is a very good preamp, but when you add the DAC card, I think the value proposition takes a step forward. The DAC card is $1,000, and I thought it was competitive with any of the under $5,000 DACs I've heard. In my view, it's noteworthy many of these DACs have sketchy volume controls, which leads to a big usability constraint. So I could almost see the LS-3 as a DAC with a good volume control, plus, of course, plenty of switching should you need it. Now, the phono card. I didn't have the MCMM phono card, but given lead designer Mike Bettinger's experience with phono amplification, I imagine it will be very good. Of course, I don't know. Also, at a price premium of only $500, if you also select the DAC card, the phono card really rounds out the value on offer here. It's hard for some to view $89.50 all in as a great value, but the combination of sound quality and features is quite competitive in my experience, especially if those features are exactly what you need. All right, operational comments and a few caveats. There are a few limitations to the LS-3. The main one, I think, will only apply to a few, but the LS-3 doesn't have an HDMI eARC input, so those wishing to use their stereo for video sound playback with their TV are not ideally served. You should also check the input-output offering to make sure it fits your needs. 4 single-ended and 2 balanced inputs will cover most people, especially if you use one or both of the card slots. There is 1 single-ended and 1 balanced output to drive amplifiers. One limitation I can see is for fans of using multiple subwoofers for room correction purposes, this output setup may not suffice. The remote is nicely sized and works well. I offered my standard critique that up and down buttons for volume control are not ideal, but the result is familiar and totally workable. The level display on the front panel is excellent, with large numerals making it easily visible across the room. The colors and intensity of the display can be set to your taste and environment. As volume is moved up and down, you hear what sound like relay clicks as you change volume in small, user-friendly increments. If you don't like that clicking sound, you simply mute the preamp and the clicks are muted too. One final note is that the finish of the casework seemed quite attractive. The box shapes are traditional audio research, albeit with a larger touchscreen display on the preamp, but the actual metalwork has beautifully small panel gaps and lovely surface details. I always like to put products such as this in context. I want to be clear that this is an excellent preamp and amp combination, but excellent preamp and amp combinations won't transform your system if it has significant problems with room treatment and setup and speaker distortions and DAC nastiness. The Audio Research S-100 and LS-3 could, however, make a very good system better. They could also form the basis for building a great system. I could easily see using either of these products with speakers up to the $50,000 per pair level, for example. Based on my time with the LS-3 and S-100, the new audio research company is a force to be reckoned with. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Audio Research LS-3 solid-state preamp and S-100 solid-state amp. If you have, we hope you join us again soon, and we thank you for watching.